Miss Marple and the Mystery of the Abandoned Estate. Good evening, dear friends, and it's wonderful to see you here at Warm Pages. I'm Edward, your host, here to keep you company as the day winds down. Tonight, greetings to Colorado. Let us know where you're listening from, and what's the weather like in your corner of the world. Subscribe if these stories bring you comfort. Now settle back and listen. Chapter 1. The House No One Mentioned. It was the particular quality of late September sunshine that Miss Marple had always found most agreeable. Not the bold brilliance of midsummer, nor yet the fading melancholy of true autumn, but something gentler and more reflective, as though the light itself had learned discretion. She stood at her cottage gate that Tuesday morning, observing the play of shadow across the lane, and reflected that villages, like seasons, had their own manner of changing tone without anyone quite remarking upon it. St. Mary Mead had been unusually quiet of late, not the peaceful quiet of contentment, but something rather more careful, as though the village were holding its collective breath. Miss Marple, whose understanding of human nature had been refined by many years of patient observation, recognised the signs. When people began to speak in vaguer terms than usual, when sentences trailed away into meaningful glances, when the weather became a topic of quite disproportionate interest, something was inevitably troubling the collective conscience. The cause, she had learned only that morning from her nephew Raymond during his weekly telephone call, concerned Alderwick Estate. The great house on Hawthorne Ridge, which had stood empty these 15 years past, was to be sold at last. A development trust from London had made an offer, Raymond had said, and matters were proceeding toward a conclusion. He had thought she might like to know, given her interest in local affairs. What Raymond could not have known, of course, was that Alderwick had never been discussed in Miss Marple's hearing. Oh, everyone knew of it naturally. One could hardly live within 5 miles of Hawthorne Ridge and remain ignorant of the largest estate in the district. But in all her years in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple could not recall a single conversation in which Alderwick had featured prominently. It was always there, in the way that certain facts are acknowledged without being examined, mentioned in the past tense if mentioned at all, and generally treated as a matter long since settled. The house itself was invisible from the village, screened by woodland and the particular fold of the hills. Its grounds were maintained, she understood, by a firm from the county town, employed by Sir Leonard Vane's solicitors. Sir Leonard himself had gone abroad after the war, to Kenya, or possibly Rhodesia, and showed no inclination to return. The estate remained locked, orderly, and entirely absent from village life. Until now. Miss Marple had encountered the first ripple of unease at the post office that morning. Mrs. Clement, collecting a parcel, had mentioned in passing that change was in the air. Miss Hartnell, sorting through newspapers, had agreed with unusual promptness that change was indeed coming, and wasn't it all for the best? The phrase had been repeated 3 times in as many minutes, always with the same emphasis, as though repetition might transform hope into certainty. It was while returning from the post office that Miss Marple had noticed the small cluster of people gathered near the village green. Not quite a crowd, but more than a casual meeting. Mrs. Beatrice Langford stood at the centre, speaking with her customary composure to Mr. Petherick, the bank manager, and young Dr. Haydock, who had taken over his father's practice the previous year. Miss Marple, who had known Beatrice Langford for the better part of a decade, observed the scene with interest. Mrs. Langford was one of those women whom villages produce with remarkable consistency. Somewhere in her middle 50s, handsome rather than pretty, with iron grey hair arranged in neat waves and a manner that combined efficiency with a sort of brisk kindness. She chaired the parish committee, organised the annual fete, and could be relied upon to know exactly who should be consulted about any matter of local importance. Her late husband had been a solicitor in the county town, and she herself came from what was generally termed good family. She wore her authority lightly but unmistakably. As Miss Marple approached, Mrs. Langford glanced up and smiled with evident warmth. "Miss Marple, good morning. We were just discussing the news about Alderwick. I expect you've heard?" "My nephew mentioned it, yes. A development trust, I understand." "That's right. The Wellbridge Trust, a very respectable organisation. They plan to convert the main house into apartments and develop the grounds for residential use. All quite tasteful, I'm assured. It will be good to see the place occupied again after all these years. There was general agreement from the small group. Dr. Haydock remarked that new residents would be beneficial to the area. Mr. Petherick noted that Sir Leonard could hardly be expected to maintain an empty house indefinitely. Mrs. Langford herself observed that the matter had been handled with admirable discretion. Sir Leonard's solicitors have been most considerate, she said. Mr. Talbot has kept us informed throughout. I believe notices will be posted at the estate gates later today, just as a formality. Everything has been done properly. Miss Marple, adjusting her shopping basket, asked mildly whether Sir Leonard himself had been consulted. Oh, naturally. Mrs. Langford's tone conveyed gentle surprise that the question should even arise. Mr. Talbot is in regular communication with him. Sir Leonard gave his approval months ago. He has no intention of returning, you see. Africa suits him, apparently. Kenya, supplied Mr. Petherick. Or was it Rhodesia? Somewhere in that region, at any rate. The climate, agreed Mrs. Langford, as though this explained everything. The winters here never agreed with him after his wife passed. Such a sad business that was. But one must look forward, mustn't one? This sale will be finalised by the new year, and then St. Mary Mead will have quite a little influx of residents. We must make them welcome. The conversation drifted to pleasantries, and the group began to disperse. Miss Marple walked slowly homeward, considering what she had heard and, more significantly, what she had observed. There had been nothing wrong with the conversation, nothing suspicious or even unusual. Yet she could not quite dismiss the feeling that she had witnessed something carefully arranged, like a scene rehearsed just sufficiently to appear natural. It was the phrase that lingered in her mind. For the best. Everyone had agreed it was for the best. But Miss Marple, whose experience of human nature extended to many village matters that had been declared for the best, knew that such consensus often concealed a multitude of private reservations. She was still pondering this when she encountered Arthur Miles near her own gate. Mr. Miles was a retired clerk, a thin, grey man in his late 60s, with the permanent stoop of someone who had spent his working life bent over ledgers. He had served as estate clerk at Alderwick before Sir Leonard's departure, and now lived quietly in one of the cottages on Mill Lane, keeping chickens and maintaining an impeccable vegetable garden. "Good morning, Mr. Miles," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "What a lovely day it is." "Miss Marple?" He touched his cap with old-fashioned courtesy. "Yes, indeed. Though there's rain coming, I shouldn't wonder. The wind has shifted." They spoke of inconsequential things for a moment before Miss Marple mentioned, as though it had only just occurred to her, that she had heard about the sale of Alderwick. Mr. Miles's expression did not change, but something in his posture stiffened very slightly. "Yes," he said, "I had heard. All very sudden, it seems, though I suppose these things move in their own time. You knew the estate well, I imagine, having worked there." "I did, yes. 20 years I was there, from 1925 to 45. I kept the books, managed the accounts, saw to the correspondence. Sir Leonard was a fair employer, very fair. It must seem strange to you, seeing it sold." Mr. Miles was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on something in the middle distance. "Everything changes, Miss Marple. Houses, people, circumstances. One cannot hold on to the past forever. It would not be reasonable to expect it." There was something in his tone, a careful neutrality that suggested he was repeating an argument he had made to himself, rather than expressing conviction. Miss Marple, who had heard such tones before, said gently that she supposed everyone was agreed it was for the best. "For the best," Mr. Miles echoed. "Yes, that's what is being said. For the best." He touched his cap again and moved on, leaving Miss Marple with a distinct impression that if she had asked him whose best was being served, she would have received no clear answer. That afternoon Lady Bantry telephoned to invite Miss Marple to tea the following day. Dolly Bantry, as always, came directly to the point. "You've heard about Alderwick, I suppose? Everyone's talking about it, or rather, everyone's being very careful not to talk about it, which amounts to the same thing. I can't quite make out why there's such a fuss. After all, the place has been empty for years. But Beatrice Langford seems to think it requires managing, and when Beatrice thinks something requires managing, one may be sure there's more to it than meets the eye. Miss Marple agreed that it did seem to have attracted a certain amount of attention. "Well, come to tea tomorrow and we'll discuss it properly," Lady Bantry said. "I've invited Beatrice as well, and Henry Talbot. We'll get to the bottom of it, whatever it is." After ringing off, Miss Marple sat in her chair by the window, her knitting in her lap, and gazed out at the September garden. The afternoon light slanted through the apple trees, gilding the lawn where autumn had begun its quiet work. Somewhere beyond the village, on Hawthorne Ridge, Alderwick Estate waited in its locked silence, holding whatever secrets 15 years of absence had allowed to settle. Miss Marple, who had learned long ago that the things people did not say were often more significant than the things they did, picked up her knitting and began to work. Tomorrow's tea party, she suspected, would prove most instructive. The question, after all, was not why Alderwick was being sold. The question was why everyone in St Mary Mead seemed so very anxious to agree it was for the best. Chapter 2. A notice posted at the gates. The notice appeared on Thursday morning, affixed to the iron gates of Alderwick Estate, with a sort of official precision that suggested it had been composed by a solicitor and approved by a committee. Miss Marple learned of it from her daily woman, Mrs. Bugle, who had heard about it from the baker's boy, who had cycled past Hawthorne Ridge on his early rounds. "All very proper, I'm sure," Mrs. Bugle said, attacking the kitchen floor with her usual vigour, though why they need to post notices when everyone knows the place is being sold, I couldn't say. Still, I suppose it's the legal way of doing things. Miss Marple, arranging chrysanthemums in a vase by the window, asked mildly what the notice said. "Oh, something about historical papers and records. Missing, apparently, or misplaced. The solicitors are asking if anyone knows anything about them." Mrs. Bugle paused in her scrubbing. "Papers from the old days, I expect, though what use they'd be to anyone now I can't imagine." "Historical papers can be valuable," Miss Marple observed, "particularly if they concern property boundaries or agreements." "Well, that's as may be, but it seems a bit pointed putting up a notice like that, almost as if they're suggesting someone took them." Miss Marple's hand stilled on the flowers. "Does the notice mention anyone specifically?" "Oh no, nothing like that. Very carefully worded, according to young Tom, but he said there's been talk in the village." Mrs. Bugle lowered her voice to a confidential tone. "About Clara Finch." The name meant little to Miss Marple, though she had a vague recollection of a Finch family living somewhere on the outskirts of the village. She said as much, and Mrs. Bugle nodded with the satisfaction of someone about to impart useful information. "Clara's father was caretaker at Alderwick, back before Sir Leonard went abroad. Lived in the lodge by the East Gate, he did, him and Clara. After he died, oh, it must be 10 years ago now, Clara moved to one of those cottages past the railway bridge. Keeps herself to herself, mostly. Works at the library and Much Benham twice a week." "I see," said Miss Marple thoughtfully. "And people are connecting her with these missing papers." "Well, it stands to reason, doesn't it? Her father had the run of the place for years. If papers went missing during the caretaking years, as the notice says, then it would have been on his watch, so to speak." Mrs. Bugle resumed her scrubbing. "Not that anyone's saying he took them, mind you. More likely just mislaid, I expect. But people do talk." Miss Marple found herself increasingly interested in what people were saying, and more particularly in how they were saying it. She had observed before that villages developed their own methods of distributing information, and that official notices often served purposes quite distinct from their stated intent. Tea at Lady Bantry's that afternoon provided further illumination. Beatrice Langford arrived punctually, as did Henry Talbot, the solicitor who had been mentioned in the previous day's conversations. Mr. Talbot was a man of perhaps 50, with the careful manner of someone accustomed to weighing his words before speaking. He wore a well-cut suit, and carried an air of professional discretion like a second skin. "Such a fuss over a few old papers," Lady Bantry said, pouring tea with her characteristic directness. "Surely it can't matter much after all this time." Mr. Talbot accepted his cup with a small nod of thanks. In ordinary circumstances, I would agree entirely. However, the Development Trust is particularly interested in establishing clear provenance for certain aspects of the estate. There were, it seems, some temporary arrangements made during the war years, permissions granted for various uses of the land, that sort of thing. Nothing irregular, you understand, but the documentation appears to be incomplete. And these papers would clarify matters, Miss Marple asked. Precisely. They would confirm that certain decisions were made properly, and with Sir Leonard's full knowledge. Their absence creates, shall we say, a slight awkwardness. Beatrice Langford set down her teacup with quiet precision. I'm sure everything was handled appropriately at the time. Sir Leonard was always most particular about such things. If records have gone astray, it will be through simple misadventure rather than any deliberate act. Oh, quite, Mr. Talbot agreed hastily. No one is suggesting otherwise. The notice merely asks if anyone might know where such papers could be found. Perfectly routine inquiry. Lady Bantry, who had been observing this exchange with the shrewd gaze that Miss Marple knew well, said, "But I understand there's been some speculation about the Finch family." A brief silence followed. Mr. Talbot examined his teacup. Mrs. Langford's expression remained composed, but something in her posture suggested increased attention. "Speculation is inevitable in such cases," Mrs. Langford said at length. "Clara Finch's father served as caretaker for many years. It's natural that people should wonder whether he might have set papers aside, perhaps thinking to preserve them, and simply forgotten to mention it. He was getting on in years toward the end." "Has anyone asked Clara herself?" Miss Marple inquired. Another pause, shorter but more telling. "I don't believe the matter has been put to her directly," Mr. Talbot said. "After all, there's no formal accusation. It seemed rather harsh to trouble her with questions, when the whole thing may simply be a matter of misfiling or administrative confusion from years ago." Miss Marple found this reasoning interesting. In her experience, when people avoided asking direct questions, it was often because they feared receiving direct answers. "Still," she said gently, "if Clara's father had any knowledge of these papers, she would surely be the person most likely to know what became of them. It seems rather unfair to allow speculation to circulate without giving her the opportunity to address it." Beatrice Langford smiled warmly. "You're quite right, of course, Miss Marple, but one must consider Clara's feelings. She's a reserved woman, not given to mixing much in village affairs. I thought it kinder to let the matter rest unless it becomes absolutely necessary to pursue it further." "Kinder to whom?" Lady Bantry asked, with the bluntness that was her privilege. Mrs. Langford's smile did not waver. "To everyone, I hope. These situations can become so unpleasant if they're not handled delicately. Clara has lived quietly here for years. I should hate to see her made uncomfortable by unfounded suspicions." It was smoothly done, Miss Marple reflected. The concern expressed, the kindness demonstrated, the whole matter wrapped in such reasonable caution that to question it would seem almost indelicate. Yet the result was that Clara Finch remained unasked, and therefore unable to defend herself, while the village was left free to draw its own conclusions. After the tea party, Miss Marple walked slowly home through the September afternoon. The light was softer now, the shadows longer. She thought about notices carefully worded and questions carefully not asked, about kindness that served to isolate rather than to include. That evening she looked up the Finch name in the parish directory that she kept for her charitable work. Clara Finch, she discovered, lived at number 3, Railway Cottages, a modest address on the far edge of the village where the houses gave way to farmland. The directory listed no occupation, though Mrs. Bugle had mentioned library work. It occurred to Miss Marple that libraries were excellent places for someone who preferred books to people, silence to conversation. They were also places where one might observe a great deal, while appearing to observe nothing at all. The following morning brought further developments. Miss Marple encountered Mr. Miles again, this time at the greengrocer's, where he was selecting apples with careful attention to their condition. He greeted her with his usual courtesy, but his expression was troubled. I understand there's been a notice posted at Alderwick, Miss Marple ventured. Yes. Mr. Miles examined an apple as though it required his complete concentration. About the papers. I saw it myself yesterday. Were you aware such documents were missing? He set the apple down and looked at her directly. His eyes, she noticed, were tired. I was aware, Miss Marple, that a great many things were set aside when the estate was closed. Some deliberately, some perhaps less so. It was a confused time. Sir Leonard left rather suddenly, you see. His wife had passed only months before, and he found the house unbearable. Arrangements were made in haste. And the papers in question? Related to wartime use of the estate, I believe. The Home Guard had a training ground in the North Meadow. There were permissions, temporary leases, that sort of thing. All quite proper, but the documentation was informal. Sir Leonard was in London much of that time dealing with ministry work. Decisions were made locally. By Mrs. Langford? Mr. Miles hesitated, then nodded slowly. She took charge of many things. Someone had to. The parish committee authorised her to act on behalf of the village. It was all done correctly. But the records of these decisions have gone missing. It would appear so. He purchased his apples and left without further conversation. Miss Marple walked home thoughtfully, her mind turning over what she had learned and what she had observed. A notice had been posted, carefully worded to avoid direct accusation. Attention had drifted toward Clara Finch, whose father had been in a position to know about estate matters. But no one had asked Clara a single question. In the language of villages, Miss Marple reflected, silence could be more damaging than speech, and suggestion more powerful than statement. Clara Finch was being allowed to remain ignorant while her reputation was being quietly compromised. The question, as always, was why? Why protect Clara from direct questions while exposing her to indirect suspicion? And more significantly, who benefited from this particular arrangement of facts and silences? Miss Marple settled into her chair by the window and picked up her knitting. The afternoon stretched before her, peaceful and undisturbed. But her mind was far from peaceful. It was occupied with papers that had vanished, questions that went unasked, and the particular way that villagers sometimes chose to remember selectively what suited them to remember. Tomorrow she decided she would pay a visit to Railway Cottages. Chapter 3. Miss Marple observes a change of tone. Railway Cottages stood in a row of 4, brick-built and modest, at the point where St. Mary Mead began to thin into countryside. They were respectable dwellings, well maintained, with small front gardens that spoke of careful tending. Number 3 showed the same neat attention as its neighbours, though the curtains were drawn despite the morning hour. Miss Marple had walked the 1.5 miles with no particular plan beyond introducing herself. She had found over the years that the simplest approaches were often the most effective, and that elderly ladies calling upon other women were seldom viewed with suspicion. She knocked and waited. The door opened after a moment to reveal a woman of perhaps 40, thin and somewhat colourless, with fair hair pinned severely back and eyes that held a defensive wariness. She wore a brown cardigan over a dove-grey dress, both serviceable and unadorned. "Miss Finch, I'm Jane Marple. I live in the village, and I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but I've been wanting to make your acquaintance." Clara Finch's expression suggested she doubted this very much, but courtesy prevailed. "Won't you come in?" The cottage interior was spotlessly clean and almost painfully quiet. Books lined one wall, arranged with library precision. A desk by the window held writing materials and a small stack of what appeared to be cataloguing cards. Everything spoke of order, solitude, and a life carefully contained. Tea was offered and accepted. Miss Marple, settling into a chair by the empty fireplace, remarked on the lovely view toward the fields. "I keep meaning to explore this part of the village more thoroughly," she said. "One can become too attached to familiar routes. I expect you know every path and lane around here, having grown up at Alderwick." Clara's hands tightened slightly on her teacup. "I lived there until I was 28. My father was caretaker." "It must have been a beautiful place to grow up." It was very isolated. The words came carefully, as though Clara were testing each one before speaking it. The lodge was a quarter-mile from the main house. We saw very few people. But your father's work would have brought him into contact with the estate affairs. He maintained the grounds and buildings. Sir Leonard relied on him. There was pride in this statement, quiet but unmistakable. My father knew every corner of the property. He cared for it as though it were his own. Miss Marple sipped her tea. I understand there's been some question about papers from that time, historical records that seem to have gone missing. Clara set down her cup with a sharp click. I heard about the notice. Everyone has been very careful not to mention it directly to me, but of course I heard. From whom did you hear? Mrs. Powell at the post office told me yesterday. She thought I should know, she said, in case anyone asked me about it. Clara's voice held a bitter edge. No one has asked me anything, but I'm quite aware that my name is being discussed. That must be distressing. It's predictable, Miss Marple. When something goes wrong at Alderwick, attention naturally falls on the caretaker's family. We lived there, you see. We were convenient. The words carried years of accumulated resentment, carefully suppressed but never quite forgotten. Miss Marple recognised the tone. She had heard it before, in other villages, from other people who had occupied positions of service and proximity without ever being granted full inclusion. Your father would have known about any papers relating to the estate's wartime use, I imagine. He knew everything that happened there. The Home Guard training, the evacuees who were housed in the West Wing for 6 months, the parcels of land that were given over to growing vegetables. My father kept notes of it all. He was a methodical man, Miss Marple. He understood that temporary arrangements had a way of becoming permanent if no one maintained proper records. What became of his notes? Clara rose and moved to the desk, opening a drawer to extract a leather-bound notebook. She handed it to Miss Marple without comment. The book contained entries in careful copperplate handwriting, dated and organised. Permissions granted, visitors received, maintenance performed. Miss Marple turned the pages slowly, noting the detail and precision. This is remarkably thorough. My father believed in documentation. He said that working people needed records more than their employers, because they were the ones who would be blamed if things went wrong. Clara turned to her chair. He kept those books for 20 years. When he left Alderwick, he took them with him. When he left, I had understood he remained until his death. He was dismissed in 1945, 3 months before Sir Leonard departed for Africa. The reason given was economy. The estate was to be closed, and a caretaker would no longer be needed. Clara's voice remained steady, but her hands gripped the chair arms. The dismissal came very suddenly. One day he was essential, the next he was surplus. Miss Marple absorbed this information in silence. The picture it painted differed considerably from the vague references to the Finch family's association with the estate ending naturally, peacefully, as all such arrangements eventually did. Was there any particular reason for the timing? There was a disagreement. My father objected to certain decisions that were being made about estate records. He felt that documents were being removed that should have been kept. He was told his concerns were unnecessary and that he was exceeding his authority. A week later, we were given notice to leave the lodge. Who dismissed him? The parish committee, on Mrs. Langford's recommendation. She explained to my father that Sir Leonard had authorised the closure and that all the arrangements were being handled properly. My father was thanked for his years of service and given 3 months' wages as compensation. Clara's mouth tightened. We moved here shortly after. He never spoke of Alderwick again. Miss Marple returned her attention to the notebook. The final entries ended abruptly in August of 1945, with no indication of the approaching dismissal. The last notation recorded a visit from Mrs. Langford and Mr. Talbot to inspect records relating to wartime land use. "May I ask," Miss Marple said gently, "whether you've mentioned your father's notebooks to anyone recently?" "I haven't spoken to anyone in the village about Alderwick in years, Miss Marple. People here have long memories and convenient interpretations of the past. My father was hard-working and honest, but because we lived in service, we were assumed to be at fault when questions arose." Clara's composure began to crack slightly. And now, 15 years after his death, the same pattern repeats itself. Papers are missing, and the caretaker must have taken them. Never mind that he kept meticulous records. Never mind that he objected to documents being removed. The story that suits everyone is the one that places blame downward. Miss Marple could hear decades of suppressed anger in those words, the accumulated weight of 1,000 small slights and careful exclusions. She thought of the conversation she'd heard, all those voices agreeing that matters had been handled properly, that concerns were unnecessary, that everything was for the best. Has anyone from the parish committee contacted you about the missing papers? No one has contacted me about anything. Mrs. Langford sent a note last week asking after my health, which I thought curious until I heard about the notice. I assume it was meant to demonstrate concern without actually addressing the substance of the matter. You've received no direct questions? Not one. But I've noticed that Mrs. Powell has become less chatty at the post office, and Mrs. Bugle mentioned in passing that people were saying I keep myself too much apart. That's how things are done here, Miss Marple. No one accuses you directly. They simply allow understanding to develop naturally, shaped by suggestion and confirmation, until everyone knows what they need to know. It was precisely observed, Miss Marple thought. Villages excelled at this form of communication, where truth could be established without anyone having to claim responsibility for establishing it. She rose to leave, thanking Clara for the tea and the conversation. At the door, she paused. I wonder if I might borrow your father's notebook for a day or two. I should very much like to read it more thoroughly. Clara hesitated, then nodded. Keep it as long as you need, but I doubt it will help, Miss Marple. The story has already been written. I'm simply waiting to see how it ends. Walking back toward the village, Miss Marple reflected on what she'd learned. The tone around Alderwick had shifted in the past week, just as autumn had shifted into the landscape without anyone quite marking the moment of change. Where the estate had once been described as unfortunate, it was now spoken of as ill-managed. Where Clara's father had been dismissed for economy, he was now remembered primarily as someone who had been in a position to misplace documents. Language, Miss Marple knew, was rarely innocent. When people altered the way they described the past, it was usually because they needed the past to justify the present. She clutched the leather notebook more firmly and quickened her pace. There was work to be done, and it began with understanding exactly what had happened in the summer of 1945, when temporary arrangements had been made permanent and an inconveniently precise caretaker had been dismissed for exceeding his authority. The question Mrs. Langford had so carefully avoided asking was the question that now required answering. Not what had Clara's father taken, but what had he tried to prevent from being taken? And by whom? Chapter 4. Voices lowered in the drawing room. Lady Bantry had a gift for assembling people who would rather not be assembled. It was not, Miss Marple reflected, that Dolly was unaware of the potential discomfort. Rather, she held the view that discomfort, properly managed, often yielded illumination that comfort never could. The tea party on Saturday afternoon appeared, on its surface, to be perfectly ordinary. Mrs. Langford arrived first, bringing a basket of early apples from her garden. Dr. Haydock followed, apologising for his muddy boots. Mr. Talbot came precisely on time, carrying his professional discretion like an umbrella against unpredictable weather. Arthur Miles, who rarely attended such gatherings, appeared last, looking as though he had been cornered into acceptance and was already planning his escape. Miss Marple, who had arrived early at Lady Bantry's invitation, observed the initial pleasantries with interest. Everyone was determinedly cheerful. The weather was discussed, the apples admired, inquiries made about various villagers' health. It was all perfectly pleasant and entirely superficial, like a play performed by actors who had not quite learned their lines. Lady Bantry, pouring tea with her characteristic efficiency, allowed the small talk to continue for precisely 10 minutes, before cutting through it with surgical precision. I understand the notice at Alderwick has caused rather more stir than anyone anticipated, she said, handing a cup to Mrs. Langford. People do love a mystery, even when there isn't one. Mrs. Langford accepted the tea with a gracious smile. I'm afraid you're quite right. One would think the village had nothing better to occupy its attention. It's all rather silly, really. Some old papers have been mislaid, and now everyone is constructing elaborate theories. Not everyone, Mr. Miles said quietly. His voice carried an edge that made several people glance toward him. Some of us remember what actually happened. A brief silence fell, the kind that precedes either confrontation or retreat. Mrs. Langford's expression remained composed, though Miss Marple noticed a slight stiffening in her posture. "I'm not sure I take your meaning, Mr. Miles." "I mean," he said, setting down his teacup with careful deliberation, "that the papers in question were removed deliberately, not mislaid. I was there when it happened. I saw them taken away." Mr. Talbot shifted uncomfortably. "Arthur, I hardly think this is the appropriate venue." "For what? For accuracy?" Mr. Miles turned to face the solicitor. "You were there too, Henry. August of 1945. You and Mrs. Langford came to the estate to review the wartime records. You selected certain documents and had them removed to your office for safekeeping. That's what you called it. Safekeeping." Mrs. Langford's smile remained fixed, but her voice took on a note of patient explanation, as though addressing someone who had misunderstood a simple matter. "That's quite correct, Mr. Miles. Several documents were indeed removed for safekeeping. Sir Leonard was leaving for Africa, the house was being closed, and it seemed prudent to ensure that important papers were not left vulnerable to damp or mice. Mr. Talbot's office was the obvious choice. And yet," Mr. Miles continued, "when I asked 3 months later whether those papers might be returned to the estate's own files, I was told they had already been returned. When I searched for them, they were nowhere to be found." Mr. Talbot cleared his throat. "There may have been some confusion about exactly which documents were involved. It was a chaotic time, as I'm sure you'll recall. Sir Leonard was distraught over his wife's death. Arrangements were being made in haste." "It was not," Mr. Miles interrupted, "chaotic in the least. I kept precise records of every document that left the estate. I noted what was taken and when. When the papers failed to reappear, I brought the matter to Mrs. Langford's attention. I was told I was being unnecessarily particular, and that I should trust that everything had been handled appropriately." Miss Marple, who had been listening with close attention while appearing to focus on her tea, noted the careful selection of words. Not misplaced, but removed. Not lost, but failed to reappear. The distinction mattered. Lady Bantry, with the directness that was her privilege as hostess, asked what exactly these papers concerned. "Permissions," Mr. Miles said. "Agreements relating to the use of estate land during the war. The Home Guard had training grounds in the North Meadow. 3 families were given allotments in the South Fields. There was some question about whether these arrangements would continue after the war ended." "And did they continue?" Miss Marple asked gently. "For a time, yes. The Home Guard disbanded, of course, but the allotments remained. The families had been told the land would be available to them until Sir Leonard explicitly requested its return." Mr. Miles paused. The difficulty was that no one could produce Sir Leonard's original authorization. Without documentation, the arrangement existed in a rather uncertain state. Mrs. Langford set down her teacup with a soft click. "I think you're making this sound more mysterious than it was, Mr. Miles. Sir Leonard had given verbal permission for the allotments. Everyone knew that. The absence of written confirmation was regrettable, but hardly sinister." "Except," Dr. Haydock interjected, speaking for the first time, "that verbal permissions become rather difficult to verify once the person who gave them has left the country. Forgive me for being blunt, but wasn't there some dispute about those allotments a few years after the war?" A flush rose in Mrs. Langford's cheeks. "There was a question about compensation when the land was reclaimed for the estate. The families felt they were entitled to something for the improvements they had made. It was resolved amicably." "It was resolved," Mr. Miles said, "by the parish committee offering compensation from village funds, since there was no documentation proving Sir Leonard had authorised the improvements. The families received less than they would have been entitled to under the original agreement, but at least they received something." "Better than protracted legal battles," Mrs. Langford said firmly, "which was precisely my point at the time. Without proper documentation, the matter could have dragged on for years. The committee acted in good faith to reach a practical solution. Miss Marple watched this exchange with the attention of someone observing a chess game. Each speaker was choosing words carefully, establishing positions, claiming moral territory. But beneath the surface, courtesy lay something harder and more pointed. The difficulty, she ventured, seems to be that the documentation once existed and then ceased to exist. That's rather different from documentation never having existed at all. Mrs. Langford turned to her with an expression of pained patience. Miss Marple, I appreciate your interest, but I think you may be reading too much into what was simply administrative confusion. Papers were moved during a difficult period. Some may have been misfiled or damaged. These things happen. But you do recall removing the papers initially? I recall, Mrs. Langford said with careful precision, assisting Mr. Talbot in reviewing estate documents to determine what needed to be preserved. I acted in the best interest of the village and with the full authority of the parish committee. And Finch objected, Mr. Miles said. He wanted everything left in place until Sir Leonard could be properly consulted. He said that removing papers, even temporarily, would create exactly the sort of confusion that eventually occurred. Mr. Finch, Mrs. Langford said, her voice cooling perceptibly, was a caretaker, not an estate manager. He had strong opinions about matters that were not his concern. He had strong opinions about accuracy, Mr. Miles corrected, which is why he kept his own records, detailed notes of everything that happened at Alderwick, including what was removed and by whom. The silence that followed was profound. Mr. Talbot looked distinctly uncomfortable. Mrs. Langford's expression suggested she was recalculating something she had thought long settled. Lady Bantry, with admirable timing, offered more tea. The moment of tension eased slightly, though the atmosphere remained charged. Dr. Haydock began discussing a case of influenza going around the district. Mr. Talbot mentioned planned improvements to the railway station. The conversation drifted back to safer shores, but Miss Marple noticed that Mrs. Langford excused herself shortly afterward, pleading a headache. Mr. Miles left soon after, and the gathering dissolved with unusual speed. When only Miss Marple and Lady Bantry remained, Dolly collapsed into her chair with the air of someone who had just staged a demanding performance. "Well," she said, "that was illuminating." "Very much so," Miss Marple agreed, though perhaps more for what wasn't said than what was. "You mean about Finch's records? I noticed Beatrice went rather pale when Arthur mentioned them." "I suspect Mrs. Langford assumed those records no longer existed. Certainly she seems to have acted on that assumption." Miss Marple set down her cup thoughtfully. "The question is whether she removed those papers to protect them, or to ensure they remained unavailable. You think she's been deliberately hiding the documentation?" "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that Mrs. Langford made decisions 15 years ago that seemed justified at the time. She was acting for the village, protecting local interests, managing a difficult situation. But those decisions required the absence of certain documentation, and now, with the sale of the estate proceeding, that same documentation threatens to resurface." Lady Bantry considered this. So the notice at the gates wasn't really asking for help finding the papers. It was testing whether anyone knew where they were. Precisely, and allowing suspicion to settle on Clara Finch served two purposes. It directed attention away from those who actually removed the papers, and it discouraged anyone from coming forward with alternative explanations. "But Arthur Miles has come forward." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "which changes matters considerably. The question now is what Mrs. Langford will do when she realises that Finch's records still exist, and that they document exactly what was removed, when, and by whom." They sat in silence for a moment, watching the afternoon light fade across Lady Bantry's garden. Somewhere in the village, Miss Marple knew, conversations were taking place that would determine how this matter would be resolved. Whether truth would be confronted or once again carefully managed into a shape that suited those who preferred comfort to accuracy. She thought of Clara Finch, living quietly at railway cottages, waiting to see how the story ended, and of Arthur Miles, who had remained silent for 15 years and had now decided that silence had lasted long enough. The drawing room at Gossington Hall had witnessed many revelations over the years. Today's had been particularly instructive. Not a confession, but something perhaps more valuable. A demonstration of how thoroughly certain people believed their own carefully constructed versions of events, and how startled they became when confronted with evidence that those versions were incomplete. "I should be getting home," Miss Marple said, rising. "Thank you for a most interesting afternoon, Dolly." "Do keep me informed," Lady Bantry said. "I have a feeling this is far from finished." Miss Marple agreed that it was not. Walking home through the early evening, she reflected that the mystery of Alderwick was revealing itself to be less about what had been taken than about what had been allowed to disappear, and that the person who had orchestrated that disappearance was only now beginning to understand that documents, like truths, had a way of surviving even the most determined attempts at burial. The caretaker's notebook rested in her handbag, solid and real. Tomorrow she would read it thoroughly, and then, perhaps, certain conversations would need to be had. Difficult conversations, but necessary ones. Chapter 5. The caretaker. Everyone forgot. Sunday brought rain, the gentle, persistent sort that settled in for the day and made indoor occupation seem not merely sensible but virtuous. Miss Marple spent the morning at church, observing that Mrs. Langford's usual place in the third pew remained conspicuously empty. The headache mentioned yesterday had evidently persisted, or else some other pressing matter had intervened. After a light luncheon, Miss Marple settled in her most comfortable chair with the caretaker's notebook and her reading glasses. Rain tapped against the windows with soothing regularity. The house was warm and quiet. She opened the leather cover and began to read systematically from the beginning. William Finch's handwriting was remarkably clear, the product of an earlier education when penmanship had been considered a mark of character. The entries began in January of 1925, noting his appointment as caretaker and the condition in which he had found the estate. Over the years, a portrait emerged of a man who took pride in thoroughness and believed that details mattered. The war years showed particular diligence. Finch had recorded every arrangement made for the Home Guard, noting names, dates, and the specific permissions granted. The allotments were documented with equal care. 3 families, the Websters, the Coles, and the Pratts, had been given use of the Southfields in March of 1941, with Sir Leonard's written authorisation noted as being filed in the estate office. Miss Marple paused over this entry. Written authorisation. Finch had not simply assumed verbal permission was sufficient. He had ensured proper documentation existed and had noted its location. The entries continued through the war years with admirable consistency. Evacuees arrived and departed, their names recorded. Rationing affected estate supplies, carefully logged. Sir Leonard made periodic visits from London, where he worked in some capacity Miss Marple gathered was related to the Ministry of Supply. Lady Vane's declining health was mentioned discreetly. Her death in February of 1945 noted with evident sadness. Then came the entries from August of that year. August 3rd, Mrs. Langford and Mr. Talbot came to review estate papers, requested access to files relating to wartime land use, showed them relevant documents in estate office. August 5th. Mrs. Langford returned with Mr. Talbot, removed documents relating to allotments and home guard arrangements, said they would be kept at Mr. Talbot's office during estate closure. I expressed concern about removing original documentation. Mrs. Langford assured me copies would be made and originals returned within a fortnight. August 20th. Inquired about return of documents. Mr. Talbot said they were being organised and would be returned shortly. September 10th. Documents still not returned. Spoke to Mrs. Langford. She said I was being unnecessarily anxious and that everything was being handled properly. Suggested I was exceeding my authority in questioning the arrangements. September 15th. Received notice of dismissal from parish committee. 3 months' wages offered as compensation. No reason given beyond economy measures. Spoke to Mr. Talbot, who said the decision was regrettable but final. The entries ceased after that except for a final notation dated December 1st. Left Alderwick after 20 years' service. Estate sealed and locked. No documents returned. No explanation given. Have my own records. Truth has a way of surfacing eventually, even when buried by those who believe themselves beyond question. Miss Marple set the notebook down and removed her glasses, thinking. The picture was now quite clear. Mrs. Langford had removed documents that proved Sir Leonard had authorised the allotments with full knowledge that improvements would be made at the family's expense. When the time came to settle the matter, the absence of these documents had allowed the parish committee to offer minimal compensation, since nothing could be proven. The families had accepted what was offered, having little choice. The village had congratulated itself on reaching a practical solution, and Mrs. Langford had been praised for her efficient management of a difficult situation. Only William Finch had known the truth, and William Finch had been dismissed before he could make that truth inconvenient. The rain continued its steady rhythm. Miss Marple rose and went to the telephone, dialling Lady Bantry's number. "Dolly, it's Jane. I wonder if you might help me with something. Do you recall a dispute about the Alderwick allotments? It would have been several years after the war." Lady Bantry's memory proved excellent. "Oh, yes, that business. Let me think. It was 1948 or 49, I believe. The Webster family had put in quite a bit of work on their plot, built a proper shed and improved the soil considerably. When the committee reclaimed the land, there was some feeling that they ought to be compensated. Beatrice handled it all very diplomatically. The families received something, though less than they'd hoped for, I gather. Do you remember Mrs. Langford's reasoning? She said the arrangements had been informal, made during extraordinary circumstances, and that while Sir Leonard had certainly allowed the use of the land, there was nothing to suggest he'd intended the improvements to be permanent. Without documentation, she argued, the committee had to balance fairness with prudence. It seemed reasonable at the time. And no one questioned whether documentation had once existed. There was a pause. I don't believe anyone thought to ask, why would they? Beatrice was acting on behalf of the village after all. She had no reason to misrepresent the situation. Unless, Miss Marple said gently, the documentation would have proven expensive for the village. If Sir Leonard had explicitly authorised permanent improvements, the compensation owed would have been considerably larger. Another pause, longer this time. You think Beatrice knew the documentation existed and chose not to produce it? I think Mrs. Langford removed documentation that would have cost the village money. At the time, she may have believed she was protecting local interest from an absent landlord's generosity. But the result was that 3 families received far less than they were entitled to, and the man who could have testified to the truth was dismissed before he could do so. Good Lord! Lady Bantry's voice held genuine shock. But that's, well, it's theft, isn't it? Or fraud. Some sort of dishonesty, certainly. It's the kind of dishonesty that well-meaning people convince themselves is justified, Miss Marple said. Mrs. Langford would have told herself she was being practical, protecting the village from undeserved expense. The families were outsiders, after all, not truly local, and Sir Leonard was wealthy enough that a few pounds more or less could hardly matter to him. She would have built quite a solid moral case for what she did. Until now, when the estate is being sold and the missing documentation threatens to surface. Precisely. Which is why the notice was posted. Not to find the papers, but to establish that if they did appear, they could be dismissed as having been in Clara Finch's father's possession, and therefore suspect. Miss Marple thanked Lady Bantry and rang off. She returned to her chair, taking up her knitting with the methodical rhythm that aided thought. The pattern was complete now. All that remained was to determine what to do with the knowledge. William Finch had been right about one thing. Truth did have a way of surfacing. But Miss Marple had learned over many years that how truth surfaced mattered enormously. Exposed carelessly, it could destroy lives without necessarily serving justice. Handled with discretion, it could correct wrongs while allowing people to preserve what dignity remained to them. Mrs. Langford had acted wrongly, certainly, but she had also acted from a misguided sense of duty, convinced that she was serving the greater good. The families had been wronged, But 15 years had passed, and compensation now would come too late to undo the genuine hardship they had suffered at the time. And Clara Finch, who had borne the weight of vague suspicion for years, deserved to have her father's reputation restored and her own name cleared beyond question. The challenge lay in achieving these outcomes without creating new injustices, or allowing old wrongs to simply fade into comfortable forgetfulness. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. Outside, the rain fell with patient persistence, washing the village clean without discrimination or judgment. Water, Miss Marple reflected, was remarkably even-handed in its effects. Perhaps truth could be as well if applied with sufficient care. Tomorrow she would speak with Mr. Miles again, and then, she thought, it would be time for a conversation with Mrs. Langford herself. Not an accusation, but an invitation to acknowledge what had happened and to consider how matters might now be set right. Some people, when confronted with their own actions, chose defensiveness and denial. Others chose honesty and repair. Miss Marple had observed both responses many times. She had a feeling that Mrs. Langford, despite her current difficulties, was capable of the latter if given the opportunity to choose it freely, rather than having it forced upon her. At least she hoped so, for everyone's sake. The afternoon light faded gradually behind the rain clouds. Miss Marple continued her knitting, thinking of William Finch keeping his careful records, believing that truth mattered enough to document it even when no one seemed interested in listening. He had been dead 10 years, forgotten by most of the village, dismissed from memory as easily as he had been dismissed from service. But his daughter remembered, and his records remained. And that, Miss Marple thought, settling more comfortably into her chair, was sometimes enough to tip the scales from injustice towards something approaching fairness. Sometimes, but not always, tomorrow would reveal which outcome this particular case would yield. Chapter 6. A reputation repeated too often. Monday morning brought clearer skies and the sort of crisp brightness that followed rain. Miss Marple walked to the village shop, ostensibly for groceries, but primarily to observe the state of local conversation. She was not disappointed. Mrs. Clement, behind the counter, was in full flow when Miss Marple entered. Her audience consisted of Miss Hartnell and young Mrs. Price from the bakery, both of whom wore expressions of attentive interest. And I said to my husband, Mrs. Clement was saying, that whatever people might think about the Alderwick business, no one could question Mrs. Langford's intentions. She's done more for this village than anyone I could name. Why, just look at the way she handled that business with the church roof fund. Completely above reproach. Oh, absolutely, Miss Hartnell agreed with enthusiasm. Beatrice has always been the soul of propriety. I won't hear a word against her. Miss Marple selected a tin of biscuits and brought it to the counter, greeting the assembled company with a pleasant smile. The conversation did not precisely halt, but it adjusted itself in that subtle way conversations do when a new participant arrives whose position on the matter at hand remains unknown. "We were just discussing Mrs. Langford," Mrs. Clement said, wrapping the biscuits with careful attention. "Such a stalwart of the community. One doesn't like to think of her being troubled by unpleasant gossip." "Has there been gossip?" Miss Marple inquired mildly. A brief hesitation followed, during which glances were exchanged. "Nothing specific," Miss Hartnell said, "but you know how people talk. Some are suggesting that Mrs. Langford might have been, well, less than thorough in her handling of estate matters years ago. It's complete nonsense, naturally." "Naturally," Mrs. Price echoed. "Why, Mrs. Langford stepped in when no one else would. If there were any irregularities, they certainly weren't her doing. She was cleaning up other people's muddles, more like." Miss Marple observed this defence with interest. It had the quality of being both spontaneous and rehearsed, as though the speakers had already discussed among themselves what needed to be said and were now saying it to anyone who would listen. "I wonder whose muddles those would have been," she asked. Another pause, slightly longer. "Well," Mrs. Clement said, lowering her voice despite the shop being nearly empty, "one doesn't like to speak ill of the dead, but old Finch was hardly the most organised of men. Devoted to his duties, I'm sure, but perhaps not quite up to the complexities of estate management during wartime. Mrs. Langford had to sort through quite a mess when Sir Leonard decided to close the house." "I see. Did you know Mr. Finch well?" "Not well, no. He kept to himself mostly, but one heard things. He could be quite difficult if he thought his authority was being questioned. Mrs. Langford had to be very patient with him. It was masterfully done, Miss Marple thought. The reputation of a dead man was being quietly adjusted to fit a narrative that protected the living. Finch had been transformed from meticulous caretaker to difficult employee. His dismissal recast as a regrettable necessity rather than a convenient silencing. She purchased her biscuits and left the shop with much to consider. The village, it seemed, was closing ranks around Mrs. Langford. Whether this represented genuine loyalty or something more calculated remained to be determined. Her next call was on Arthur Miles, whom she found in his garden tending to late autumn vegetables. He straightened when he saw her approaching, pulling off his gardening gloves with the air of a man grateful for interruption. "Miss Marple, I thought you might come by after Saturday's conversation." "It did raise several questions," Miss Marple agreed. "I wonder if you might tell me more about the compensation arrangement for those allotment families, the Websters, the Coles, and the Pratts." Mr. Miles gestured toward a bench near his potting shed. They sat, and he was silent for a moment, arranging his thoughts with the precision Miss Marple had come to expect from him. "It was handled through the parish committee in 1948, he began. "I wasn't directly involved, being retired by then, but I heard about it from several sources. The families had been using the land for 7 years, had made substantial improvements. When the committee decided to reclaim it for the estate, there was naturally some feeling that compensation was warranted. But the amount offered was less than expected, considerably less. The committee's position was that the original arrangement had been informal, a wartime expedient, and that while the families deserved something for their trouble, the village couldn't be held responsible for assumptions they'd made about permanency." He paused. Mrs. Langford presented it as a generous gesture rather than an obligation. The families, being working people without means to challenge the decision, accepted what was offered. And no one mentioned that written authorization had existed. If anyone knew about it, they said nothing. Sir Leonard was in Africa, unreachable for practical purposes. The committee had Mrs. Langford's account of events, and she was trusted implicitly. Still is, by most people. His expression grew troubled. "I've been thinking about that a great deal since Saturday. How reputation can become its own form of evidence." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Mrs. Langford has done considerable good for St. Mary Mead over the years. That's not in question." "No, it isn't, which makes this all the more difficult. She's not a villain, Miss Marple. She's a woman who convinced herself that what served the village served justice, and once convinced, she's never allowed herself to doubt it. The repetition of her virtues isn't just other people defending her, it's her defending herself, over and over, until the defence becomes indistinguishable from truth." It was an astute observation. Miss Marple had seen the pattern before, in people who performed good works partly from genuine charity, and partly to build insurance against their own consciences. Each act of service became another layer of armour, another reason why they couldn't possibly have acted wrongly in the past. "Do you know what became of those families?" she asked. "The Websters moved away in 1950, somewhere north. The Coles are still in the district, I believe, though they've never been much involved in village life. Tom Pratt died in an accident at the factory some years back, but his widow still lives in one of the council houses." Mr. Miles's voice held genuine regret. "They were decent people, Miss Marple. They worked that land hard and made it productive. They deserved better than they received. And Mrs. Langford knows this? I think she knows it in the way people know things they've decided not to examine too closely. She spent 15 years building a version of events that she can live with. The missing documentation was simply gone. Finch was simply difficult. The families were simply unfortunate. Each piece reasonable on its own. Together they form a structure that can't be questioned without the whole thing collapsing." Miss Marple rose to leave, thanking him for his time and candour. Walking back toward the village centre, she reflected on the strange mathematics of reputation. Mrs. Langford's good deeds were genuine and numerous. They counted for something, certainly. But they could not be allowed to erase or excuse the harm she had caused, however unintentionally at first. The difficulty lay in making people see that acknowledging fault need not mean denying virtue, that someone could have acted wrongly and still be, in most respects, a good person. It was a nuanced understanding, and villages generally preferred their judgments less complicated. She encountered Dr. Haydock near the post office, looking harried after his morning rounds. "Miss Marple, I'm glad to run into you. I wanted to say, well, Saturday was rather eye-opening. I'd always assumed the Alderwick business was straightforward, but Arthur raised some troubling points." "You were very young when it all happened, I imagine." "I was at medical school. By the time I came home everything was settled history, but I've been thinking about what was said, about the allotments particularly." He lowered his voice. "My father was on the parish committee then. I remember him being troubled by the compensation question, but saying that Mrs. Langford had investigated thoroughly and found no evidence of written agreements. He trusted her judgment completely." "And now?" Dr. Haydock looked uncomfortable. "Now I wonder if trust was being used as a substitute for inquiry. My father was a good man, but not a suspicious one. If Beatrice said the documentation didn't exist, he would have believed her. It wouldn't have occurred to him to ask whether it had once existed and been removed." "That's the advantage," Miss Marple observed gently, "of being widely trusted. People don't question your statements because they can't imagine you would mislead them. And perhaps you begin to believe yourself that if you say something with sufficient conviction, it becomes true." "She's not a dishonest woman," Dr. Haydock said, almost pleading. "I've known her my whole life." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "She's a woman who made a decision she thought was right, and then spent years ensuring she never had to confront evidence that it wasn't. That's rather different from deliberate dishonesty, though the effects may be similar." Dr. Haydock nodded slowly, still troubled, and excused himself to continue his rounds. Miss Marple walked on, her mind turning over the accumulating picture. Mrs. Langford's reputation was being invoked like a shield, by herself and by others. Each repetition of her virtues served to make questioning her more difficult, more seemingly disloyal. It was a form of social armour that had taken years to construct, and would not be easily penetrated. But Miss Marple had observed that the strongest armour often concealed the deepest vulnerability. People who insisted most loudly on their righteousness were frequently those most afraid of discovering they had been wrong. Mrs. Langford's reputation had become both her protection and her prison. The question was whether she could be helped to step out of that prison voluntarily, or whether she would defend it to the last, becoming smaller and more isolated within its walls. Tomorrow, Miss Marple decided, she would find out. A direct conversation with Mrs. Langford could no longer be postponed. Not an attack, but an offering, a chance to acknowledge what had happened and to choose repair over continued concealment. Whether that chance would be accepted remained to be seen, but it had to be offered. Justice demanded it, and so did compassion, both for Mrs. Langford and for those she had wronged. Chapter 7. What was removed before the locks were changed. Miss Marple had learned long ago that difficult conversations were best conducted in neutral territory, with tea at hand and sufficient daylight remaining to suggest the possibility of resolution before nightfall. She invited Mrs. Langford to tea on Tuesday afternoon, phrasing the invitation in terms that were cordial but carried a certain unmistakable seriousness. Mrs. Langford arrived punctually, dressed with her usual careful elegance. She carried herself with the composure of someone who had decided how the conversation would proceed and was prepared to maintain that course through any difficulty. Miss Marple, pouring tea from her best china, recognised the signs. She had seen that particular set of the shoulders before, in people who had constructed elaborate defences and now stood ready to man them. "It's kind of you to invite me," Mrs. Langford said, accepting her cup. "I confess I've been wanting to speak with you privately. There seemed to be rather a lot of misunderstanding circulating, and I thought you might help me address them." "I should be happy to discuss the matter," Miss Marple said, "though I'm not sure misunderstanding is quite the right word for what's happening." Mrs. Langford's expression tightened slightly. "You've been speaking with Arthur Miles." "And with Clara Finch. And I've read her father's notebook, which contains quite detailed records of estate affairs from 1925 through 1945. A moment of stillness followed. Mrs. Langford set down her teacup with careful precision, as though this action required her complete attention. "I see," she said finally. "Then you formed certain conclusions, I imagine." "I formed an understanding of what happened, yes. Documents were removed from the estate in August of 1945, shortly before it was closed. Those documents proved that Sir Leonard had authorised permanent improvements to the allotment land. When the parish committee reclaimed that land 3 years later, the absence of documentation allowed compensation to be set far below what the families were entitled to receive." Mrs. Langford's face had gone pale, but her voice remained steady. "That's a rather harsh interpretation of events, Miss Marple." "Is it inaccurate?" "It's incomplete. You're describing actions without understanding the circumstances that necessitated them." Mrs. Langford drew herself up slightly. "When Sir Leonard left for Africa, he did so in considerable distress over his wife's death. He wanted nothing more to do with Alderwick or England. The estate was being closed indefinitely, possibly permanently. Someone had to ensure that matters were left in proper order." "And you took that responsibility upon yourself." "The parish committee asked me to assist. I had Sir Leonard's authorisation to act on behalf of local interests." Her tone carried the conviction of someone who had repeated this justification many times. The allotment arrangements were complicated. The families had indeed been given permission to use the land, but the terms were unclear. There were questions about what would happen if Sir Leonard decided to sell, whether the families could claim any permanent rights. Questions that the documentation would have answered. Questions that the documentation raised without resolving. Sir Leonard's letters were generous in spirit but vague in substance. He told the families they could use the land as long as they wished, but he'd also reserved the right to reclaim it if circumstances changed. I judged that those papers, if they surfaced later, could create false expectations and lead to protracted disputes. Miss Marple refilled the teacups, giving Mrs. Langford time to recognise what she had just admitted. When she spoke, her voice was gentle but firm. "So you removed them to prevent disputes, and when disputes arose anyway, you were able to claim the documentation had never specified permanent rights, because no one could examine it to determine what it actually specified." Mrs. Langford's composure wavered. "I acted in the village's interest. Those families were outsiders, Miss Marple. They'd been given a wartime privilege, and had begun treating it as an entitlement. If we'd honoured Sir Leonard's vague promises, it would have cost the village considerably, money we needed for other purposes. So you decided that protecting village funds justified suppressing evidence." "I decided," Mrs. Langford said with sudden intensity, "that practical considerations had to outweigh sentimental ones. Sir Leonard was a kind man, but not a practical one. He made generous gestures without thinking through the consequences. Someone had to think them through. And when William Finch objected to your thinking?" The question landed with quiet force. Mrs. Langford looked away, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. Finch was devoted to Sir Leonard in a way that blinded him to reality. He thought every word Sir Leonard spoke was sacred writ, regardless of whether it made sense. When I explained that certain papers were being safeguarded to prevent misunderstanding, he accused me of concealment. He threatened to write to Sir Leonard directly. Her voice hardened. I couldn't allow that. Sir Leonard was in mourning, trying to build a new life. The last thing he needed was his former caretaker stirring up trouble over documents whose meaning was ambiguous at best. So you had him dismissed. The committee concluded his services were no longer required. It was business, Miss Marple, not vengeance. And yet the timing was remarkably convenient. 3 weeks after he questioned your handling of the documents, he was given notice. Mrs. Langford stood abruptly, moving to the window as though the view might offer refuge from the conversation. When she spoke again, her voice carried a note of weary defiance. I've spent 15 years serving this village. I've organised fetes and charity drives, sat through interminable committee meetings, sorted out disputes and managed problems that no one else wanted to touch. I've given my time, my energy, and a considerable portion of my late husband's estate to keeping St Mary Mead functioning smoothly. And now you sit here and suggest I'm some sort of criminal. because I made difficult decisions to protect people who trusted me. I'm suggesting, Miss Marple said quietly, that protecting people didn't require harming others. The Websters, the Coles, the Pratts, they trusted too. They believed the village would treat them fairly. Instead, they were given a fraction of what they were owed, and the man who tried to stand up for them was driven out of his position. They were compensated. They were silenced. There's a difference. Miss Marple set down her own cup. You've built a remarkable structure over the years, Mrs. Langford. Good works piled upon good works, each one making it harder for anyone to question whether the foundation was sound. But foundations matter, and when they're built on convenience rather than honesty, the entire structure becomes suspect. Mrs. Langford turned from the window, her expression caught between anger and something that might have been desperation. What do you want from me? A confession? Public humiliation? Should I stand up at the next parish meeting and announce that 15 years ago I made decisions that weren't perfect? Will that satisfy you? I want, Miss Marple said calmly, to understand whether you've ever acknowledged to yourself what you did. Not the version you've told others, or even the version you've told yourself when you needed to sleep at night, but the truth, plain and unadorned. The silence stretched between them. Outside, a bird called from Miss Marple's garden. The afternoon light slanted through the windows, illuminating dust motes in the air. Mrs. Langford stood very still, as though she were a statue slowly coming to life. I told myself, she said at last, her voice barely audible, that it was necessary, that the village needed protecting from Sir Leonard's impractical generosity, that Finch was being difficult and that his dismissal was simply unfortunate timing. I told myself these things until they became the only version of events I could remember clearly. And now? Now I'm being asked to remember differently. She returned to her chair, suddenly looking older and more uncertain. The notice at Alderwick, Mr. Talbot suggested it as a way of testing whether anyone knew where the documents might be. I told myself we were simply trying to establish facts. But when speculation began to settle on Clara Finch, I didn't discourage it. I thought if people believed her father had misplaced papers, it would explain their absence without raising questions about who had actually taken them. You were hoping to make Clara bear the uncertainty her father had refused to bear. Mrs. Langford flinched. I was hoping to avoid exactly this conversation, to let the matter fade as so many matters do, managed through vagueness until everyone loses interest. I've become very good at that over the years, Miss Marple, managing through vagueness. It's so much easier than facing things directly. Miss Marple allowed these words to settle. She had reached the point in many such conversations where people stood at a crossroads between continued defensiveness and genuine reckoning. Which path Mrs. Langford chose would determine everything that followed. The question now, Miss Marple said gently, is whether you're willing to stop managing and start repairing. The families are owed compensation they never received. Clara is owed an acknowledgement that her father was right to question what was done, and you are owed the opportunity to make amends while you still can. Mrs. Langford sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, her expression that of someone performing internal calculations too complex to articulate. The afternoon light continued its slow progress across the room. The teacup sat cooling and forgotten. If I acknowledge what I did, she said finally, everything I've built will be questioned. Every decision I've made, every committee I've chaired. People will say I can't be trusted. Some people will say that, Miss Marple agreed. Others will respect you for having the courage to admit error and make it right. But either way, the alternative is worse. You can't continue to live inside a version of events you know to be false. It corrupts everything it touches. Mrs. Langford closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, something had shifted in her expression. Not acceptance, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of willingness to consider it. What would repairing it look like? She asked. And Miss Marple, who had been waiting for precisely this question, began to explain. Chapter 8. A letter that was never quoted. The following morning brought Miss Marple a visitor she'd not expected. Henry Talbot arrived at 10:30, carrying his professional discretion like a carefully folded umbrella that might be needed if conditions deteriorated. "Miss Marple, I hope I'm not calling at an inconvenient hour. Mrs. Langford came to see me yesterday evening. She said you had spoken, and that there were matters I needed to know about." Miss Marple invited him in and offered tea, which he accepted with the air of a man who suspects he will need fortification. They settled in the sitting room, and Mr. Talbot arranged his thoughts with lawyerly precision before speaking. "I've been Sir Leonard's solicitor for nearly 30 years, he began. "I've always prided myself on thoroughness and proper procedure. What Mrs. Langford told me yesterday suggests I was considerably less thorough than I believed." "In what respect?" "In the matter of those documents removed from Alderwick in 1945. I was present when they were taken, as Mrs. Langford said. But I accepted her assurance that they would be copied and returned, and I failed to verify that this actually occurred. When questions arose about the allotments 3 years later, I relied on her account that the documentation had been vague and inconclusive. I never asked to see the actual papers." "Why not?" Mr. Talbot's expression suggested he had been asking himself this same question. "Because I trusted her judgment. Because she seemed so certain, and I had no reason to doubt her. And because, I'm ashamed to say, it was easier to accept her version of events than to pursue an inquiry that might prove awkward for everyone involved." Miss Marple recognised the honesty in this admission. Mr. Talbot was not attempting to excuse himself, merely to explain how a conscientious man could have failed to notice something he should have seen. "What do those documents actually contain?" she asked. "That's what troubled me most when I finally examined the matter properly. I went through my firm's files last night. We still have copies, not the originals Mrs. Langford removed, but correspondence I'd retained from Sir Leonard regarding estate business." He drew a folded letter from his inside pocket. This was written in March of 1941, shortly after the allotments were established. He handed the letter to Miss Marple. The paper had yellowed slightly, but the typing remained clear. She read it carefully, noting the precise language that was so different from the vague authorizations Mrs. Langford had described. Sir Leonard had written to Mr. Talbot outlining his intentions for the allotment land. The families were to have use of it for agricultural purposes for the duration of the war, and afterward, subject only to 6 months' notice if he wished to reclaim it for estate purposes. Any improvements made at the family's expense would be compensated at fair market value should the land be reclaimed. The letter concluded with instructions that these terms be documented properly and copies provided to the families concerned. "This is remarkably specific," Miss Marple observed. "Quite. Sir Leonard was always clear in his instructions, whatever Mrs. Langford may have suggested about his vagueness. The difficulty is that I never connected this letter with the later dispute because Mrs. Langford assured me the terms had been different, less formal, essentially verbal permissions that left interpretation open." Mr. Talbot's voice carried genuine distress. "I believed her because I had no reason not to, and because checking would have implied distrust." "Have you spoken with Sir Leonard about this?" "Not yet. I wanted to understand the full scope of the situation first. But I shall have to write to him, of course. He's been kept ignorant of matters affecting his own property, and as his solicitor I bear responsibility for that." He paused. "Mrs. Langford said you suggested there might be a way to address this without unnecessary damage to anyone involved. I confess I'm at a loss as to what that might be." Miss Marple folded the letter and returned it to him. "The families are entitled to compensation they never received. That much is clear and must be addressed. But how it's addressed matters considerably. If this becomes a public scandal, Mrs. Langford will be destroyed, and the village will be torn by accusations and recriminations. If it's handled quietly, with dignity, justice can be served without creating new victims." "You're suggesting a private settlement?" "I'm suggesting honesty combined with discretion. Sir Leonard should be informed of what happened. The families should receive what they're owed, with proper explanation, and Mrs. Langford should acknowledge her error to those directly affected. But none of this requires public proceedings or widespread knowledge of the details. Mr. Talbot considered this carefully. Sir Leonard would have to agree to such an approach. He might well feel betrayed and want the matter exposed. He might. But from what you've told me of his character, he seems a decent man who would prefer to see things set right rather than to see people punished. If the situation is explained to him properly, emphasizing that compensation will be provided and acknowledgement made, he may choose the more generous path. And the compensation itself? The amounts would be substantial, particularly with 15 years' consideration. That, Miss Marple said, is a question Mrs. Langford will need to answer. She acted on behalf of the parish committee, using village funds to settle the original dispute at reduced rates. The committee authorised her to act, even if they didn't know all the circumstances. The question is whether the burden should fall on her personally, or be shared more broadly. Mr. Talbot absorbed this in silence. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating his troubled expression. He was, Miss Marple thought, a fundamentally honest man confronting the limits of his own diligence. "There's another consideration," he said finally. "The Development Trust purchasing Alderwick will want clear title to the property. If there's any suggestion of disputed rights or incomplete settlements, it could complicate or even prevent the sale. That affects everyone in the district who would benefit from the estate being occupied and productive again. Then there's additional incentive to resolve this cleanly and completely. The families receive just compensation, Sir Leonard's intentions are honoured, and the sale proceeds without complication. Everyone benefits except those who prefer old wounds to remain unhealed." You make it sound straightforward. The principle is straightforward. The execution will be more delicate. It requires Mrs. Langford to humble herself before people she wronged. It requires Sir Leonard to be more forgiving than he has reason to be. And it requires the families to accept late justice without bitterness. Miss Marple's tone remained gentle but firm. None of that is easy. But it's possible, which is more than can be said for many situations where time has hardened wrongs into permanence. Mr. Talbot rose to leave, tucking the letter carefully back into his pocket. At the door he turned back with evident hesitation. "Miss Marple, may I ask how you became involved in all this? It's not exactly the sort of matter that falls naturally into anyone's purview, particularly someone not directly connected to the estate or the families." Miss Marple smiled slightly. "I was curious about why everyone was so determined to agree that the sale was for the best. In my experience, that degree of consensus usually conceals something people would rather not examine. Once I began paying attention, the pattern became visible, and once visible, it required addressing." "You could have left it alone. Most people would have." "Most people," Miss Marple agreed, "prefer not to disturb settled matters. But some matters, Mr. Talbot, are not truly settled. They're merely covered over, and what's covered tends to resurface eventually, often in more damaging forms. Better to address it directly while there's still opportunity for genuine resolution." After he left, Miss Marple returned to her sitting room and took up her knitting. The rhythmic click of needles provided a soothing counterpoint to her thoughts. She had set several things in motion now, pieces moving on a board only she could see clearly. Whether they would fall into proper arrangement remained uncertain, but the possibility existed where none had before. The afternoon brought Lady Bantry, arriving with her characteristic energy and a basket of apples from Gossington's orchard. "I've heard the most extraordinary things," she announced, settling herself without preamble. "Dr. Haydock mentioned that Henry Talbot called on you this morning looking positively haggard, and Mrs. Clement told me she saw Beatrice Langford in the chemist's buying headache powders, which apparently means the world is ending because Beatrice never admits to ailments. What on earth have you been doing?" Miss Marple provided a careful summary, omitting certain details that need not be widely known. Lady Bantry listened with fascination, her expression shifting from curiosity to comprehension to something resembling satisfaction. "So it's all been about those blessed papers, and Beatrice took them and then couldn't admit it without making herself look dreadful. How perfectly medieval of her. Not medieval exactly, more human than that. She convinced herself she was acting rightly, and once convinced, she couldn't bear to be proven wrong. Will she actually go through with making amends? Or will she retreat into that fortress of virtue she's built and dare anyone to storm it? That, Miss Marple said thoughtfully, remains to be seen. She's reached the point of acknowledging what she did, at least privately. Whether she can extend that acknowledgement to others depends on resources of character I'm not certain she possesses. She'd better possess them, Lady Bantry said firmly, because if this comes out badly with accusations and counter-accusations flying about, St. Mary Mead will be insufferable for months. We'll have factions and feuds and all sorts of unpleasantness. Much better for Beatrice to eat humble pie quietly and have done with it. Miss Marple agreed, though she suspected humble pie would prove particularly difficult for someone who had spent 15 years being praised for her decisiveness and efficiency. But the alternative was worse, and perhaps Mrs. Langford had sufficient sense to recognise that. The letter Henry Talbot had shown her remained vivid in her mind. Sir Leonard's clear instructions, so carefully ignored, so thoroughly buried beneath convenient interpretation. That letter represented more than documentation. It represented the difference between how things were supposed to work and how they had actually worked, between intention and execution, between the version of events people needed to believe and the truth they had chosen to forget. Tomorrow, Miss Marple thought, she would visit Clara Finch again. It was time to tell her that her father's reputation would be restored, and that the truth he had tried to preserve had finally surfaced despite all attempts to keep it submerged. Some truths, Miss Marple reflected, were remarkably persistent. Like weeds in a garden, they could be cut back and covered over, but their roots remained alive, waiting for the right conditions to push through into daylight once more. Chapter 9. How the blame settled where it was convenient. Miss Marple found Clara Finch in her small garden, cutting back the last of the summer perennials with methodical attention. The October morning was crisp and bright, the sort of day that made outdoor work pleasurable rather than merely necessary. Clara straightened when she heard the gate, her expression guarded until she recognised her visitor. Then something in her posture eased slightly, though wariness remained. "Miss Marple, I wasn't expecting you." "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion. I have news, and I thought it best delivered in person rather than by letter or telephone." Clara set down her secateurs and gestured toward the small bench near the cottage door. They sat, and Miss Marple noted that Clara's hands, resting in her lap, were not quite steady. "It's about the papers, I imagine. Has someone decided I took them after all?" "No," Miss Marple said gently. "Someone has decided to acknowledge what actually happened to them. Mrs. Langford came to see me 2 days ago. We had a rather long conversation about the events of 1945. Clara's expression remained carefully neutral, but her eyes showed a flicker of something that might have been hope struggling against long-practiced caution. And what did Mrs. Langford say? She admitted that she removed documents from the estate, intending to safeguard them during the closure. She admitted that when your father questioned this decision, she arranged for his dismissal, and she admitted that when those documents failed to reappear, she allowed everyone to believe they had simply been lost or misplaced. The silence that followed was profound. Clara stared at her garden, at the neat rows of cut-back plants waiting for winter, her face working through emotions too complex to articulate immediately. "She admitted it," Clara said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "After 15 years of my father being thought careless at best and dishonest at worst, she's admitted it. She has, and more than that, she's agreed to make formal acknowledgement to those who need to hear it. Your father's reputation will be restored, Clara, properly and publicly, insofar as these things can be public without becoming spectacle." Clara's composure fractured. She covered her face with her hands, shoulders shaking with silent tears. Miss Marple waited quietly, allowing grief and relief to run their course. After a few moments, Clara lowered her hands and wiped her eyes with deliberate care. "I'm sorry. It's just, I've carried this for so long. Knowing what happened, knowing my father was right, but unable to prove it or even speak about it without seeming bitter and defensive. And now you tell me it will be acknowledged. It will. Mr. Talbot has been in contact with Sir Leonard, explaining the situation, Sir Leonard has responded with both distress and generosity. He's authorised compensation for the families who were underpaid 15 years ago, and he specifically requested that your father's accurate record-keeping be noted in the final settlement documents. My father kept those notebooks because he believed truth mattered, Clara said, her voice stronger now. He used to say that working people needed documentation more than their employers, because they were the ones who would be blamed when things went wrong. He was right about that, wasn't he? He was entirely right. The blame settled where it was convenient rather than where it belonged. Your father objected to that convenience, and he paid for his objection with his position and his reputation. But his insistence on accuracy has now made justice possible. Clara stood and walked to the edge of her garden, looking out toward the fields beyond. Miss Marple allowed her this moment of privacy to absorb what she had learned. "What will happen to Mrs. Langford?" Clara asked, not turning around. "That depends partly on you. She's prepared to apologise directly, if you're willing to receive such an apology. She's also resigned from her position on the parish committee. The official reason will be health considerations, but those who need to know will understand the true reason. And the village? Will they know what she did? Some will. The families being compensated will certainly know, as will those directly involved in the settlement. But the details need not be broadcast widely. Mrs. Langford has agreed to acknowledge her errors to those she harmed. Whether her reputation survives that acknowledgement is less important than whether the truth is finally told." Clara turned back, her expression thoughtful. "I should hate her, shouldn't I? For what she did to my father, for the years I've spent under vague suspicion, but I find I mostly feel tired. Tired of carrying anger, tired of the whole business." "Hatred requires considerable energy," Miss Marple observed, "and it changes nothing except the person doing the hating. You're allowed to feel however you feel, Clara. You've earned that right." "I'd like to hear her apology, not because I need it for my own peace, but because she needs to say it. Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense. Apologies serve the apologizer as much as the apologized to. Perhaps more so." They sat together in companionable silence for a moment. A robin hopped across the garden, investigating the newly disturbed earth. The morning remained clear and bright, innocent of the human complications being discussed. "There's something else," Miss Marple said. "The compensation Sir Leonard is providing. It's substantial. More than the original amounts owed, actually, as he's included interest calculated over 15 years. Part of that compensation is designated for you." Clara looked startled. "For me? But I wasn't owed anything." "Your father was wrongfully dismissed. Sir Leonard feels, and Mr. Talbot agrees, that compensation is warranted. They've calculated what his pension would have been had he remained in service until natural retirement, and you'll receive that sum." Clara sat down rather suddenly. "I don't know what to say." "You might say you'll accept it. The money won't undo what happened, but it represents acknowledgement of the injustice done." "Then I'll accept it, and perhaps I'll use some of it to have a proper headstone made for my father's grave. Something that notes his years of faithful service at Alderwick Estate. Would that be inappropriate?" "I think," Miss Marple said warmly, "it would be entirely appropriate. Your father deserves to be remembered accurately." Arthur Miles had been Miss Marple's next call that afternoon. She found him in his sitting room, reading the newspaper with an expression of mild contentment. He set it aside when she entered, gesturing her to a chair. "I've been expecting you," he said. "Henry Talbot came by this morning to explain what's being arranged. I'm to receive compensation for my silence, apparently, though I told him I'd kept silent from cowardice rather than conspiracy." "You kept silent from an understandable desire not to create difficulties for yourself," Miss Marple corrected. "There's a difference between cowardice and prudence." "Is there? I've been wondering about that for 15 years, he smiled ruefully. "At any rate, I'm grateful the matter is being addressed. The Webster family will be particularly pleased, I think. They've struggled financially since moving north. The compensation will make a considerable difference." "Mr. Talbot has tracked down all 3 families. They're being contacted this week. And Mrs. Langford? Is she bearing up under the weight of her conscience?" "She's bearing up. Whether she's learning anything from the experience remains to be seen." Mr. Miles considered this. "She's not a wicked woman, Miss Marple. Just a certain sort of woman who believes her own good intentions justify questionable means. The village is full of such people, acting in everyone's best interest without quite asking what everyone might actually want." "It's a common failing," Miss Marple agreed, "and one that causes considerable harm despite the best of intentions, or perhaps because of them. Good intentions can be remarkably blinding." "Will the truth destroy her, do you think?" "I think Mrs. Langford will survive, though perhaps not quite in the form she's accustomed to. She'll have to become slightly smaller, slightly less certain of her own righteousness. That may prove uncomfortable, but it's not necessarily destructive. Sometimes becoming smaller in one's own estimation is the first step toward becoming larger in one's humanity." They spoke for a while longer, of village matters and autumn weather, of the changes coming to Alderwick and what they might mean for St. Mary Mead. When Miss Marple rose to leave, Mr. Miles walked her to the door. "Thank you," he said simply, "for not letting this stay buried, for insisting that truth mattered even when it was inconvenient. There aren't many people who would have bothered." "Truth has a way of becoming more inconvenient the longer it's ignored," Miss Marple replied. "Better to address it while repair is still possible." Walking home through the October afternoon, Miss Marple reflected on how blame had indeed settled where it was convenient. On a dead caretaker who could not defend himself, on his daughter who lacked the social standing to question village consensus, on vagueness and administrative confusion, rather than on deliberate choices made by people in positions of authority. Convenience was seductive. It allowed people to avoid difficult questions, to preserve comfortable relationships, to maintain social structures that benefited some at the expense of others. Mrs. Langford had used convenience as a tool, and the village had accepted that tool gratefully because it made their own lives simpler. But convenience, Miss Marple had learned, exacted its own costs. It required forgetting, or pretending to forget. It required accepting versions of events that didn't quite align with observed facts. It required treating some people as more disposable than others. The costs accumulated slowly, invisibly, until one day someone asked an inconvenient question, and the entire structure of convenient assumptions began to collapse. She thought of Clara Finch, finally able to speak her father's truth without seeming bitter, of Arthur Miles, who had carried guilt for remaining silent, of the 3 families who had received justice long delayed but still meaningful, and of Mrs. Langford, who was learning that even the most carefully constructed reputations rested on foundations that had to be honestly laid. The evening light slanted across St. Mary Mead, golden and peaceful. The village looked exactly as it always had, but Miss Marple knew it had changed in ways that would only become apparent over time. Truth, once surfaced, altered everything it touched. Not always dramatically, but always irreversibly. And that, she thought, settling into her chair with her knitting, was as it should be. Chapter 10. An estate closed, a matter left open. By mid-November, the matter had been settled in all its practical particulars. Henry Talbot had prepared the necessary documents, Sir Leonard had authorised the transfers, and the 3 families had received their compensation with expressions of gratitude mixed with bemusement that justice should arrive so unexpectedly after such a long delay. Mrs. Webster, contacted through relatives in Yorkshire, had written a particularly touching letter, noting that the money would allow her to help her daughter with nursing school fees. The Coles, still living in Much Benham, had accepted their settlement with quiet dignity. Mrs. Pratt, the widow, had wept when Mr. Talbot explained that her late husband's work on the allotment was being formally recognised and compensated. Clara Finch had received her father's pension settlement and, true to her word, had commissioned a headstone that noted William Finch's 20 years of faithful service at Alderwick Estate. The stone had been set in place the previous week, simple and dignified, bearing dates and facts that spoke more eloquently than elaborate epitaphs could have done. The sale of Alderwick to the Wellbridge Trust had proceeded smoothly, the title now clear of any complications. Work was scheduled to begin in the spring, converting the main house to apartments and developing the grounds with appropriate sensitivity to the landscape. St Mary Mead would gain new residents, and the estate that had stood empty so long would live again in altered form. Miss Marple learned all this through the various channels by which information flowed through villages: Mrs. Bugle's reports, chance encounters at the post office, Lady Bantry's comprehensive intelligence network. She listened, observed, and reflected that settlements on paper were considerably easier to achieve than settlements of the heart. It was a grey afternoon in late November when Mrs. Langford came to call. Miss Marple had been expecting this visit, though she had not been certain it would occur. Beatrice Langford stood at the door looking older than she had a month previous, her composure intact but somehow thinner, as though it required more effort to maintain. "Miss Marple, I wonder if I might speak with you for a few minutes." "Of course. Please come in." They settled in the sitting room, and Miss Marple noted that Mrs. Langford declined tea, sitting instead with her hands folded in her lap, gathering herself to say what needed saying. "I've apologised to Clara Finch," she began without preamble, "and to Arthur Miles. Mr. Talbot arranged meetings with the three families, and I spoke with each of them, explaining what had happened and why. It was—" she paused, searching for words, "more difficult than I had anticipated. Apologies usually are when they're genuine. I found myself wanting to explain, to provide context, to make them understand that I had believed I was acting correctly. But that would have been asking them to comfort me, wouldn't it? To absolve me of discomfort. So I simply acknowledged what I had done and expressed regret for the harm caused." "How did they respond?" "Clara was remarkably gracious. She said she appreciated my honesty, and that she hoped we might both find peace in the matter being resolved. The families were less certain of me, which is understandable. Mrs. Pratt said she forgave me, but that she wished I'd been honest 15 years ago when her husband was alive to see his work recognised." Mrs. Langford's voice wavered slightly. That was difficult to hear, because she was absolutely right. Miss Marple allowed the silence to extend, giving Mrs. Langford time to compose herself. "I've resigned from the parish committee, as I said I would. The official reason is health considerations, but several people know the truth. I've had some awkward conversations, lost one friendship entirely, and been the subject of considerable speculation. It's been instructive to discover that reputation, which I thought I had built through years of service, can evaporate quite quickly when the foundation is questioned." "Not entirely evaporated, surely?" "No, not entirely. Some people have been kind, even supportive. Dr. Haydock visited and said that everyone makes mistakes, and that acknowledging them required courage. Lady Bantry sent a note saying she respected my honesty, though she couldn't resist adding that she'd always suspected I was too perfect to be entirely real." Mrs. Langford smiled faintly. That was rather typically Dolly. "And how do you feel about all this? Not what you think you should feel, but what you actually feel?" Mrs. Langford considered this carefully. "Lighter, oddly enough, as though I've been carrying something heavy for so long that I'd stopped noticing the weight until I set it down. But also rather lost. I'd built my entire life around being the person who knew what was right and acted accordingly. Discovering I wasn't always that person has left me uncertain about who I actually am." "Perhaps," Miss Marple suggested gently, "you're discovering that you're human. Fallible, capable of error, but also capable of acknowledging error and attempting repair. That's not less than what you were before, it's more honest." "Is honesty always better? It's caused considerable pain." "The pain was always there, Mrs. Langford. It was simply being borne by other people. You've redistributed it more fairly, which is uncomfortable for you, but more just overall." Mrs. Langford nodded slowly. "I came to thank you, actually, for not allowing me to continue hiding from what I'd done, for insisting that truth mattered even when I desperately wanted it not to. I'm not grateful in the way one is grateful for pleasant things, but I'm grateful nonetheless. What will you do now?" "I've been thinking about that. I have time, suddenly, without committee work. I thought I might volunteer at the library in Much Benham. Clara Finch works there, and while we're not friends exactly, we've reached an understanding. She suggested they could use help with the cataloguing. Mrs. Langford's expression held wry self-awareness. It would be useful to work in a position where I'm not in charge of anything, where I can simply be helpful without needing to manage or direct. That sounds like wisdom, or penance, perhaps both. She rose to leave, then paused. Miss Marple, may I ask what made you pursue this matter? It would have been far easier to let it rest buried. Miss Marple considered her answer carefully. I've noticed that buried things have a way of poisoning the ground they're buried in. Clara Finch was suffering from vague suspicion. The families had been denied justice. Your own conscience was troubling you whether you admitted it or not. The village was maintaining a comfortable fiction at considerable cost to everyone involved. Someone needed to insist that the cost was too high, and that someone was you. I had the advantage of being old, relatively unimportant in village affairs, and thoroughly immune to concerns about popularity. It's remarkable what one can accomplish when one's reputation is already established as that of an interfering old woman. Mrs. Langford's smile was genuine for the first time in the conversation. You're hardly unimportant, Miss Marple, but I take your point. Thank you for everything. After she left, Miss Marple returned to her chair by the window. The grey afternoon was fading toward early dusk, the bare branches of the garden trees stark against the dimming sky. Winter was approaching, the season of dormancy and patience, when growth happened invisibly beneath surfaces that appeared empty. Lady Bantry telephoned that evening full of news about the settlement and eager to discuss every detail. So it's all tidied up nicely, she concluded. The families compensated, Clara vindicated, Beatrice humbled, and Alderwick finally moving forward. You've managed it beautifully, Jane. I wouldn't say managed exactly. Events reached a point where truth was less avoidable than it had been. I simply helped people see that acknowledging it was preferable to continuing to avoid it. Well, however you describe it, the village is better for your interference, though Beatrice will never quite be what she was. No, Miss Marple agreed, but what she was included a substantial element of self-deception. What she becomes may prove more genuine, even if less commanding. They spoke of other things before ringing off, and Miss Marple sat in the deepening dusk thinking about estates and matters left open. Alderwick had been closed for 15 years, its gates locked, its grounds maintained but empty, its past carefully sealed away. The estate itself would soon open again, transformed by new purpose and new residents. But the matter surrounding it, the removed documents, the dismissed caretaker, the families cheated of fair compensation, that matter had never truly been closed. It had simply been declared closed by people who preferred closure to examination. Memory, Miss Marple reflected, was not so easily managed. William Finch had kept his records. His daughter had preserved them. Arthur Miles had remembered. And when the conditions were right, when someone bothered to ask inconvenient questions, the whole carefully constructed version of events had unravelled to reveal the truth beneath. Villages preferred their doors closed, their past settled, their narratives comfortable. But memory tested locks, especially those fastened for convenience rather than necessity. And sometimes an elderly lady with time, curiosity, and a stubborn commitment to accuracy could apply just enough pressure to those locks to reveal that they had never been properly secured at all. Outside, the evening settled over St. Mary Mead with its usual quietness. Lights appeared in cottage windows. Smoke rose from chimneys. The village life continued in its customary patterns, altered in ways that would only gradually become apparent. Miss Marple picked up her knitting, her needles finding their rhythm in the gathering darkness. The pattern was complex but familiar, requiring attention without demanding it. She worked steadily, thinking of nothing in particular, content with the knowledge that some things at least had been set right. Not perfectly, never perfectly, but honestly, which was perhaps the more important achievement. The matter of Alderwick Estate had been settled at last. Not closed. Nothing was ever truly closed, but settled, acknowledged, addressed with as much justice as 15 years' delay allowed. And that, Miss Marple thought, clicking her needles in peaceful rhythm, would have to be sufficient. It was, after all, considerably more than had existed before.